welcome to Beyond the Knife, a medical history podcast brought to you by Surgeons Hall Museums, Library and Archives. We are part of the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh. I am Chanté, Director of Heritage and Estates at the college. Each episode, I'm joined by a guest who shares a story from the history of medicine and surgery. This episode contains discussions on topics that some people may find distressing. Please take care while listening. For more than 3 centuries, Edinburgh has been a city of medicine, a place of learning and discovery of extraordinary breakthroughs. Home to the oldest medical school in the English-speaking world, the city helped shape how we understand the body, illness and care. But no history of progress is ever simple. In this episode of Beyond the Knife, we step inside Edinburgh, City of Medicine, a new temporary exhibition at Surgeons Hall Museum, a collaboration between the museum here and the University of Edinburgh. Through extraordinary collections and the stories they carry, we explore not only what medicine achieved, but what it asked of people along the way. Some stories inspire awe, others ask something more difficult of us. They invite us to reflect on the human cost of learning, on questions of consent and dignity, and on the lives that became part of medicine's making. This episode does not ask us to choose between pride and discomfort, instead it invites us to hold both. Join Malcolm MacCallum, Curator of the Anatomical Museum at the University of Edinburgh, and Thomas Elliott, Head of Surgeons Hall Museums, as they guide us through a history that continues to shape how we understand medicine and ourselves. So, Malcolm, you are a new guest to the podcast, so we're going to start with our warm-up question, which we put to all of our guests, which is, if you could be present at any moment in the history of medicine, what would it be and why?
So this is a little bit niche, but I'm going to take you back to the tercentenary celebration of the university, 1884-85, and that coincided with the opening of where I work, the Anatomical Museum, a big grand building, and they decided to launch the tercentenary celebration with a very posh sounding luncheon for over 600 people in the museum. So it was all the great and the good of the medical world, and apparently they stopped halfway through and there was a play by students, a Walter Scott play was taking place, and I think there was a lot of drink available, and I think there was all sorts of decorations in the museum. I'd have loved to be there to see the museum. We've only got black and white photographs of the front of the museum, really. I'd love to just wander around the galleries in 1884 when the museum opened, and I suppose at one point I'd have to go and speak to some of these professors of anatomy, and I'd be speaking to William Turner as well, just asking him about the collection, and I've got a few questions about things that we can't quite find. So I think it'd be a very useful research trip as much as anything else. So that's what I would choose.
So that is, what was the date again? 1884?
1884, yeah. So it's the 300th anniversary of the university's foundation.
In Edinburgh, in the Anatomical Museum. So as a museum person, I immediately went to, oh my gosh, so much food and drink in the museum. But of course, that didn't matter in those days, did it?
There was lots of plants as well, apparently. They made it very green, the space. So it would be quite a cool thing to see.
It's a fantastic answer. So Thomas and Malcolm, you have just co-curated an exhibition, which is now open at Surgeons Hall Museum. And it talks about the history of Edinburgh as a medical city, of course, and celebrates this 300 years of the Edinburgh Medical School. So, Thomas, for anyone listening who's never really thought about Edinburgh as a medical city, can you give us a picture? What happened here and why does it matter?
So yes, you're right to say that the Edinburgh Medical School was founded 300 years ago in 1726, but part of the exhibition explores what foundations were in place before then, and really the story starts back in 1505 with the founding of this college, when we started as the Incorporation of Surgeons and Barbers of Edinburgh. And from day one, there was that tradition of training, of proving competence by exams, learning about the body, how it works, what happens when things go wrong. And so that tradition of trying to increase our knowledge and understanding of the body, and hopefully then in terms of treating patients with whatever illness, was long established. And so we wanted to kind of set the scene that Edinburgh was this city that was becoming more and more known for medicine. And when the medical school was founded, that really was the trigger to then, the reputation exploded, I guess, and Edinburgh really was a preeminent medical centre in Europe.
I love that it's not a competition, right? But it sort of is. So the college is like 1505, 520 years, and Edinburgh Medical School, which is phenomenal, obviously, 300 years anniversary today. The really remarkable thing is that for most of us listening, we can probably all trace something about the standard of our own health today back to what was happening in Edinburgh 300 years ago. So the influence of what was discovered and what was developed in terms of healthcare was phenomenal in the city, right?
Yes, but as I say, I mean, to give listeners some idea of just the scale of things, if we even go back to the early 1800s, within a half mile, radius within the city, we have a university medical school, we have a college of surgeons who are doing their own training, and we have, at any given point, up to half a dozen private anatomy schools. So students were flocking from all over the world, literally, to Edinburgh because it was seen as the place to come and get the best medical training or surgical training.
A kind of medical zeitgeist.
Exactly.
So, though 300 years is a long time, when you started working on this exhibition together, what was the spine of the story? What did you choose to actually pull out?
Well, we had the date and we had the exhibition space. So on the face of it, it's an exhibition about 300 years of the medical school. But I think it's about a lot more than that. I think it's really about people. I think the initial idea was that we were looking at teachers, students, the patients, the included and the excluded. But it's also about consent or the lack of consent in terms of donating bodies for medical research. And then we add in things like the politics of education, the role that women were allowed to play, Edinburgh's position with the British Empire and how human remains are being taken from anywhere that the British have been, basically. So it became about a lot of things. It became partly social history, partly medical history. But for me, and I think for Thomas as well, it was really about people. People were the heart of this exhibition.
And if I can just add to that, Malcolm's spot on with her thinking. Part of that people story is the notion that it is a shared history for good and bad. So all the remarkable achievements, the progress that was made, and also some of the challenging issues that we face today, around consent and how bodies were used and so on. That's a history shared between the university and of the college. And that's where the strength lay. We both have this very ancient tradition and there's lots of overlap. So people who were working surgeons at the time then later become professors at the university and vice versa. And we wanted to make the most of that.
I think that's a really fantastic answer that you both gave. What really strikes me about Surgeons Hall Museum, the Anatomy Museum, is that they are both historic collections that are part of living institutions today. So we are still training surgeons. You have surgeons teaching at the university. You are training medical students. So that all of those years of medicine or that history of medicine is in direct conversation with what's happening today. And that the great thing about this exhibition is that it talks about the progress, it talks about the achievements and the human cost. So it is all of the terrible things that happen throughout history to make those achievements so that we can learn from them today. And so that medical students, surgeons today have that information to help make things better today. And I think that really comes through. So we have two separate collections that are essentially, a 10-minute walk away from each other, but still separate collections that you're bringing together in the same room. So Malcolm, as a curator, when you physically brought those collections together that have never really been shown side by side, what did that unlock for you?
I mean, I could probably reach for a clever curatorial answer, but I think it's quite simple. I think it just unlocked a fuller picture of the story of the history of medicine in Edinburgh and beyond. As you said, we've got two separate collections and both institutions have slightly different roles in terms of their heritage and their museum. So my museum, the Anatomical Museum, is really open once a month to the public. We're not really public facing, whereas I know Surgeons Hall Museum gets remarkable numbers. It's open 7 days a week. The collections are similar but different. I think moving the objects from my museum to this new gallery, it's very strange seeing museum objects from my place that are in these new display cases. That changes the context to them. But the thing that really unlocked for me is just the strength of these both collections when they are combined. Not just the museum collections, but the archival collections as well. I would be talking about something in the collection and Thomas go, oh, that name sounds familiar. I'll speak to colleagues at archives. And similarly, I had this they've got this interdependent relationship, I think, historically. And so it just unlocked that. The picture was much clearer, I think.
So what we thought we'd do for the rest of the podcast is really focus in on the objects, so the things that are physically in the collection for our listeners too. So Thomas, to start us off with, there is a cutaneous horn from 1671 on display. So for those of us who have no idea what that is, I certainly didn't until I started working with you, what does it tell us about how people understood the body before modern medicine?
Well, yes, I wouldn't expect many people, thankfully, will have come across a cutaneous horn. So it's essentially it's a growth on the surface of the skin caused by an overproduction of keratin. Keratin's the same substance, the same material that your fingernails and your toenails are composed of, and it is literally a horn growing out of the skin, often on sun-exposed parts, so on the forehead or on the face or on the hands. And we have this horn, this remarkable horn that was removed from a woman in 1671, and this was something that came from the Anatomical Museum. And when Malcolm showed me it initially over there, when we were selecting things as a short list for what we might display, what struck me was this incredible outgrowth that literally looks like, I don't know, a very long, gnarled fingernail removed from this poor woman's head in 1671. But on the horn itself, there's a silver medallion that's engraved, and very unusually, it tells you the woman's name, it tells you the surgeon's name that removed it. And I thought, that just brings it home that, these are not just things in cases. These are part of a person and part of a person's suffering in the past, and in this case, hopefully, part of a person's relief from suffering. And so it immediately became my favourite thing in the museum when I came back and learned that the surgeon, a man called Arthur Temple, who I'll be honest, I had never heard of previously, when I came back from the Anatomical Museum and done a bit of reading, I was delighted to discover that in the 1600s he was what would now be called president of the college, at the time deacon of the incorporation, not once but twice, just a few years before he removed this growth from the woman's head. In terms of what it tells us, back in those days, medicine, like so many other fields, it was dominated by kind of half-truths, a bit of myth and legend. So when it came to diagnosing illness, we relied on astrology a lot. And so for someone like that woman to have this unfortunate growth, I can't imagine, what she might have gone through in terms of people's reaction to her. Is she a witch? Is she this? Is she that? And the poor woman must have had all sorts of psychological suffering, never mind any physical pain. So I think it really brought it home to me of just how much we've moved forward because of the remarkable 300 years that we have.
It's so interesting how quickly something like that stops being just medical and does become a judgment about the person. So, date-wise, it's, a few decades. Is it something like not even 20 years earlier, women are being executed in Edinburgh for being a witch, right? So if you had that kind of growth, you were clearly a witch, so you were going to be burned. That short period of time where things start to change, and of course, change takes lots and lots of time, but you're absolutely right, that horn, I do find it fascinating that there is a silver medallion on it as well, though, that it is inscribed as a moment.
Yes, absolutely. Now, we have object labels for anything, whether it be an instrument or a piece of art or whatever. This is almost like the world's most grandiose object label of this engraved silver medallion. But I'm so pleased that it's there and it recorded what might have been lost.
And I think you speak to this, the people again, which you both spoke to at the start of this podcast too, that this exhibition is about people. So that the 300 years, 500 years of people in Edinburgh. So Malcolm, to that point, there is a letter written in William Burke's blood in this exhibition. There is a cast of his brain. There is a scrapbook of his crimes. There is possibly his hat, possibly a piece of his skin. When we talk about Burke in here, in relation to the things that are shown in this exhibition, at what point did you think, this is really, really interesting, we absolutely have to include these items in the exhibition?
I think individually all these items are extraordinary. I don't think they've ever been put together to tell the story before in the same case. So I think it was probably just when we were installing the case and you start to see them lining up together, you think these are really quite important. They all tell a slightly different story about the time. The blood letter is obviously very strange. I think it speaks a little bit to medical ethics because we believe it was the professor of anatomy, Alexander Monroe Tertius, who was performing dissection, wrote the letter, Why did he write the letter? We're not sure. So every object that we have has almost more questions than answers, because Alexander Monroe Tertius was not a showy-off individual. So was this a souvenir? We just don't know why he did it. So beside that, we have the scrapbook. So actually the blood letter is within the scrapbook. So a great resource, original and primary sources of newspaper cuttings, tabloid style reporting, it seems to me, from the 1820s. It shows you the sensationalism of the trial. It shows you the whole Burke and Hare story had just gripped the people of Edinburgh, and that is reflected in the huge crowds that saw Burke executed, and then the similarly huge crowds that saw him after he'd been dissected at the Old College. This is all referenced in the scrapbook itself, so it's a brilliant historical resource, but a strange thing to have in your scrapbook, I have to say. The brain cast, something different. It was actually an endocranial cast, so it's a cast of the inside of the skull, and this was taken not by an anatomist, but we think by a phrenologist. So this idea that the lumps and bumps in your head can tell you if you're going to be a good person or a bad person, or indicate your personality or characteristics. So phrenology we see today very much as a racist pseudoscience, but at the time when Burke was being executed, it was very popular in Edinburgh. And we're trying to work out what made Burke do these crimes. Did he have an organ or a bump of benevolence, which was enlarged, and an organ of destructiveness, which was even more enlarged than his benevolence bump? So it was all kind of nonsense, I would say. And finally, the hat and the skin that came from Stirling Museum. Disclaimer, it's not my object, so I don't know the provenance, if it's watertight or not. If these items do belong to Burke, then they're sensational, because you've got this personal memento of an infamous individual in Scottish history. And if they don't belong to Burke, I think it tells you something about that industry that had developed quite quickly. The souvenirs became a bit of a trade to trying to get Burke memorabilia. So every one of these is extraordinary. Put them all together, then they become exceptionally extraordinary, I would say.
So just for listeners who might not know the story of Burke and Hare, they are known as the Westport murderers. This is a time, of course, where Edinburgh is at its height of medicine, as you both described, and there was a drive for bodies, just a need to dissect, and there weren't enough bodies to go around. So that's what led to grave robbing, and then Burke and Hare essentially think, do you know what, we're not going to dig up graves, we're just going to move straight to murdering. Over a 10-month period when 1828, they murdered at least 16 people, and this is specifically to sell their bodies for dissection. And the thing I find particularly wild about all of this is that they are selling bodies to a man named Robert Knox, who was head of Surgeons Hall Museum. Literally one of our predecessors, Thomas.
Yes, I think I like to think that the head of museum role has changed somewhat since those days, and also the personalities may have changed. But yeah, no, it does speak directly to, as we mentioned, that shared history, for better or worse. Both institutions faced the same challenges, dealt with things in similar ways when it comes to questionable ethical decisions made and such like, as well as all the incredible progress. And it applies as much to Surgeons Hall Museum as it does to the University of Edinburgh. But yes, Robert Knox was an incredible teacher, quite clearly. He ran the most popular anatomy class in the UK at the time, so he had a huge need for bodies, and I guess he must have just had the scientific blinkers on and thought, well, if I ask no questions, I'll not get any awkward answers that I might not like. But a very, very controversial figure in our history because of that direct involvement with those murders.
Yeah, morally absolutely questionable, with a drive to further medical education in a way that we absolutely wouldn't do today. So the people that Burke and Hare murdered were on the margins of society. So they're deliberately poor, they're deliberately targeted because they're unlikely to be missed. So some of them we know by name, some of them just by description, some of them we don't know at all. And I think what's interesting as well about things on display in the exhibition, so the skin from Burke, which, yes, is a loan from Stirling Smith Museum. And yeah, the provenance dates back. It's a really interesting provenance, isn't it? That traces back to a person who was there when Burke was dissected. So similar to the letter written in Burke's blood. So we have this time where that idea of the body being something that is taken for dissection, taken to further education, but also taken as souvenir, that same sort of spirit that Burke ended up in as well, I do find really fascinating.
Yes, and I think, some people will ask, what is the hold almost that Burke and Hare has over Edinburgh? If you come into the city as a tourist, you can't avoid Burke and Hare, whether it's, names of pubs, or they feature in so many of the ghost tours and walking tours and such like. But I guess what that object tells me, and Malcolm's alluded to it there, is that that fascination was there from day one, because it was such an extraordinary scandal. 16 innocent people murdered by two people specifically to sell the bodies to medical schools. This is not a modern day reflection of, wow, isn't that amazing, or isn't that horrific, or whatever it may be. At the time, this was a huge, huge scandal, and it kind of burned into the soul of Edinburgh, as it were.
And that idea that things had to change, that no longer would the public stand for not only their graves being robbed at the time, but also that you might be murdered for the sake of medicine. And of course, it did lead to change as well, which was good.
Yes, absolutely. As a direct result of this, and similar case in London, who then in the popular press became known as the London Burkers, where a gang went out and killed people to sell them to medical schools. Thankfully, it led to a change in the law in 1832 with a new Anatomy Act that was brought in. It was far from ideal itself, but it was certainly a step forward.
Yeah, you've got it, which had its own problems, but was at least a step forward. So, Malcolm, also in the collection, there is a wax moulage showing smallpox. So for those of us who've never encountered a moulage, what is it and why was it made?
So moulage is cast off a part of the body. It's usually made by pouring wax into a plaster mould, and then you've got a representation of the part of the body that you're studying. It's an ancient technique. I think it dates back from the 1700s in Florence in Italy. But as medical specialties like urology and dermatology were established, it was started to use as a teaching tool. Now, the advantage of it is the cast that you make on whatever condition it is shows you the condition in 3 dimensions. So it's better than a 2-dimensional book. This is obviously in the time before photography and sort of medical imaging. The casts were realistic. Sometimes they're too realistic for me. They show blisters and patches of skin, scars and things like that. But it was quite often they were painted up as well to make them even more realistic as well. They'd be used as teaching aids, largely for students. The museum that I'm in has got quite a large collection of these moulages, and we think they were taken from the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, patients who had presented there with various conditions. What's a bit unusual about them, I quite like about some of them, is they were taken from living patients. A lot of the conditions are not going to be fatal. A lot of it is just showing various kind of dermatology, like things like eczema, things like that as well. It's a glimpse, again, slightly social history, because you're seeing industrial diseases, you're seeing examples of the real living people of Edinburgh attending medical resource centres and being cast up, and their conditions were then used to teach future generations of medical students as well.
The moulages are incredible, and this one really is incredible because it does really feel like you are looking at a person. So you have the sort of tactileness of the wax, and also the horrors of smallpox, which looks so painful, and literally the expression shows that pain.
Yeah, I mean, this is a cast of a face of a young person, but you do see the individual pustules in alarming detail on the wax. Smallpox was one of these diseases that didn't seem to go away in Edinburgh. It was still very prevalent up to the early 20th century. So very important that doctors understood it and understood it quickly, and then sort of known how to treat it as well.
So from smallpox to brandy, Thomas, there is also on display James Young Simpson's brandy decanter. And this was used in his early chloroform experiments, we think. And that is his decanter in the exhibition, right?
That is indeed his decanter. I hope he gave it a good wash after he had the chloroform in it. Yes, so the story of Simpson is one of these remarkable periods of discovery in Edinburgh in medicine, and in medicine generally, but there were some key events happened in Edinburgh, not least of which was James Young Simpson becomes the first person anywhere in the world to use chloroform as an anaesthetic. So this was a few years after dentists in the United States had used a chemical called ether to remove pain as they were taking out rotten teeth and such like. And like anything new in science, you constantly look for refinement, you look to improve things and hone things. Ether was seen as not a very pleasant chemical to inhale for a patient. It often made them nauseous and caught in their lungs and so on. So the search was on for an alternative. And Simpson, with the help of some chemist friends and colleagues who put him on to the possibility of chloroform as an effective anaesthetic, he then decides to take the risk himself, and him and his colleagues would meet up of an evening in the house after dinner and experiment with these different chemicals, inhaling them. Don't think that would pass as a clinical trial today, but fair play to him that he took the risk himself before he then introduced this to patients. So the brandy decanter was simply used to store the chloroform at one of these occurrences when they were doing the experiments. But yes, it's a glass decanter engraved with the word brandy, and it always kind of raises a smile, I think, when people think, oh, he was actually storing the chloroform in his brandy decanter.
So, Malcolm, you wanted to go to the party in 1884 in the Anatomy Museum. I would like to go to James Young Simpson's house. So he lived in one of those amazing Georgian flats on Queen Street in Edinburgh, and he would have these parties. Absolutely, they were experimenting with lots of things. But I read that he welcomed guests with a glass of chloroform champagne, which we've talked about in early podcasts as well. I want to go to James Young Simpson's house and be welcomed with a glass of chloroform champagne.
I have to say that neither Malcolm nor I were offered a glass of chloroform champagne this morning, so I'm gutted.
Yeah, I wouldn't trust the hangover for that.
The hangover would be terrible. He did believe that it made people more convivial, right? And relax them, because he loved conversation. He's one of my favourite surgeons from history, I have to say.
Or maybe you just sleep off the drink. I don't know how it would work.
You're right. You'd wake up post-hangover. It's the perfect plan. So within the body of pain management, the other thing on display, Malcolm, is a cast of a baby's head made at the first delivery ever carried out under ether anesthesia. So when you encounter something like that in the collection, what goes through your mind?
There's a couple of emotions actually with this object. The first is wonder, because this is such a pivotal moment. This is, we've all, or hopefully all of us, have benefited from anaesthesia in our lifetimes. We know about the personal journey of medical health and how important anaesthesia is. So for this to be the first ever use of it for childbirth is incredible. But then the sadness comes in, because when you look at the story a bit more, you realise that the child didn't survive, sadly. So this is a cast of a child who's not lived. And then you find a little bit about the mother. The mother did survive. The mother reported later that she had no pain. She sort of came through the procedure. I'm calling them the mother and the child because we don't know their names, so they're kind of written out of the history of this story. We know all about James Young Simpson. We know all about his work in anaesthesia with ether and then chloroform. But there's 3 people in this story, but we only really know the names of one of them.
It is such a remarkable object. What strikes me about it is it's so small, because of course it's the cast of a baby's head. But it is that moment, isn't it, where we have had a history where women have been denied pain relief for birth for hundreds of years, or thought that, maybe not, that's not the right way of putting it. It was thought that women should experience pain when delivering, because that would make them better mothers, and that was part of some kind of divine process. So there was always this line in Genesis that was cited that was a reason not to intervene with women experiencing pain in childbirth. So this notion that the church said this is a holy right, physicians have to step back and allow this to happen. And of course, this is the period where that starts to shift, where of course, there are physicians, there are doctors who start to say, and James Young Simpson is amongst them, among other men, and of course a history of midwives, female midwives who have been fighting against this, who start to say, no, we have to step in here and be able to manage this pain. But I think there is that moment as well where this one tiny cast of a baby's head collapses that history into that moment of change, that moment where things started to get better, which I find so fascinating as well.
I think also it looks like some of the ladies or the women of Edinburgh are benefiting from anaesthesia before Queen Victoria is. When Queen Victoria adapts it becomes much more mainstream. So there's advantages of living in Edinburgh if you have all this progress and innovation going on as well.
Definitely, definitely. If the Queen's taking it, then it becomes hard to argue against. And then, of course, there is a period where it is only privileged women, so only women in certain parts of society who get this medication, this pain relief. So that history takes a long time before it becomes much more widespread as well. So Thomas also displayed is Charles Darwin's class card from his time studying medicine in Edinburgh, and he lasted about 2 years before abandoning his degree. Is he Edinburgh medicine's greatest dropout?
Well, I'm glad you said that and not me. Darwin is a huge hero of my own. So certainly in terms of the name, I was so excited to see these class cards were really almost like attendance tickets to courses and lectures, and the students would present them to attend a course of lectures. And Darwin, like many others, came to Edinburgh because aside from being a medical hub, it was very much a kind of intellectual hub. Edinburgh was the place to come and mix and discover and learn from writers, from poets, from scientists, all in this one incredible mix. So Darwin was part of that chorus of discovery, I suppose. Apparently when he was here, he didn't take to particularly the anatomy classes, the dissections. He found it very grotesque, or I think he didn't have the stomach for it. And so whether he quickly abandoned any notion of a medical career at that point, we're not 100% sure, but he certainly came across others in Edinburgh, other people who then became an influence, geologists and naturalists and so on. And he wouldn't be unusual at all. Nowadays we think of people enrolling or matriculating at a university. You have a 3-year course in politics or a 4-year course in whatever your subject is, and you come hell or high water, you stick at it and you hopefully get through and you graduate. But back in those days, there were numerous, thousands upon thousands of people who would come and maybe almost see it as a more modular thing. They would come and do just a discrete course without any real ambition to end up getting a full degree at the end of it. And so there was the graduation rate, I guess is what I'm trying to say, was actually pretty low at the time.
Yeah. I think also when you think of Charles Darwin, you think of that photograph of him with the big bushy beard as the old man. He was only 16 years old when he came to Edinburgh. Some 16-year-olds make the wrong choices, don't they? So I know I probably did. I definitely know Thomas did. And I think also where you see there's a plaque where he lived in Potter Row, just attached to the National Museums of Scotland. He literally just had to roll out of bed about 3 metres, and he'd been in his anatomy classes at the old college, and he quite often didn't do that, so he obviously was not really enjoying it, his subject studies at all.
But we won't hold that against him.
Roll out of your bed into the anatomy class. Amazing. I mean, I have worked there for 2 years and I am still finding my nerve with a lot of these collections. I think for many of us, dissection, anatomy can be quite challenging. So for me, I completely understand Darwin, particularly if he's only 16 years old. How interesting to think of Darwin as a 16-year-old young man in Edinburgh. So, Malcolm, one of the most striking things on display in the exhibition as well is a price list showing what medical students paid for dissected human remains. What does it feel like to hold something like that, knowing these people were real?
It feels very strange. I think seeing the price list out of context as well. It's normally on the walls of the medical school in the museum, at the Anatomical Museum. It's now in a case in a different context completely, and I think it just strikes home how unusual and how, I suppose, it's challenging as well. These were individuals who were divided up into teachable parts and then sold to the students for study. We don't know quite often who these individuals were. They certainly wouldn't have any names attached to the individual body parts as well. But believe it or not, this was also progress, because this was an authorised trade, I suppose, because the poster says it's the Inspector of Anatomy for Scotland who has licensed this to happen. So this was, believe it or not, progress, because it was controlled and it was used within the medical system. And there's various rules. You weren't allowed to have more than one body part at a time, sort of a first come first basis in terms of how you enrolled for the degree. So basically, if you're older and studying, you got the first choices to the body parts as well. My overriding thought is how strange it looks when it's not on the wall of the museum.
When you take it out of that context.
Yeah.
Just to add to that, if you think the Anatomical Museum is used pretty much exclusively by medical students who are undergoing training. So seeing that poster, I guess, that framed poster on the wall in that context, I guess for most medical students, they wouldn't bat an eyelid. They wouldn't see it as unusual. It's just, it's part of the story. Whereas to bring it into the context of Surgeons Hall, it really brings home just what an odd thing it is, to be, as you say, it was a licensed trade, but you were essentially selling parts of a body or buying parts of a body to further your own studies. And I think it's quite good for our visitors to, it brings home the idea that there's all sorts of things required to train to become a doctor, things that as a doctor you take absolutely for granted, and as anyone who's not a doctor, you think, wow, I didn't quite realise that it involved that amount.
So almost like a textbook. You were buying a textbook, but it was a part of a body. Malcolm, is it useful to reassure people today that that's not what happens at the University of Edinburgh anymore?
Yes, I really should have said that. It definitely is not what happens. We rely on body donors who consent to giving their bodies to study of medicine. So the students cannot buy body parts and take them home or whatever they did with them previously.
There's a beautiful film shown as part of the exhibition. It's one of my favourite things, and one of the people featured in that film is a woman who had spoken with her husband about, they thought, what a good idea it would be to donate their bodies after their death. And she speaks so beautifully about what a positive experience it was. This is a woman who's alive today. Her husband passed a few years back. And she speaks very lucidly and very articulately about what a positive experience it was, and how understanding the staff were when she approached them about, the possibility of donating their body for medical teaching.
Yeah, body donation, it's a completely different world today. And you've both spoken to the history of consent and how consent has changed over time. And that's something we talk about a lot and think about a lot working with collections like this. So the other object on the exhibition that aligns with this is a vaginal mesh donated by Lisa Megerson, and that Lisa was the patient herself. And again, thinking about that history of consent, that's a different kind of consent to almost everything else that we have in the collection on display in the exhibition. How does that object change the atmosphere around it?
I think that you're right. It's unique for us. It's, as far as we all understand, it's the first and only, so far, example of something where, as a museum, we were approached by the patient. And so Lisa got in touch with us a few years ago. She had this mesh that was implanted, as many women did at the time. It was seen at the time as an excellent treatment for urinary incontinence that sometimes follows things like childbirth, seen as a fantastic standard of surgical treatment. And to be honest, in the early days, everything indicated that was the case. But within a few years, many women were complaining of chronic pain and suffering horrendous ordeals, and no one was listening to them in the medical community. And so Lisa wanted that story to be told, and she approached us while the mesh was still in her body. And so that's an incredibly powerful story for us to be able to tell to a modern audience. That medicine is continually evolving. We're continually facing new challenges, whether it be, a real scientific sticky problem that we just don't understand one element of the body or a treatment plan, but also challenges in medical ethics. As we get better at treating people, the ethical debate has to keep up with what is available, because what is available doesn't necessarily mean that you should do it. And it applies in medicine, it applies in other technology as well. So it's a really powerful story, and we were so pleased when Lisa approached us. And Lisa sees herself as, a real advocate for that idea of patients should be listened to.
Absolutely. There was a wonderful story from the opening event that we had for the exhibition where an ex-colleague, Sophie, a curator at National Museum Scotland, talked about being in the exhibition on the at the opening event, and she's looking at the TVT, the vaginal mesh, and the woman standing next to her suddenly says, "That's me," and it was Lisa. And she said it was the most extraordinary experience she had because, of course, that is very rare that ever happens. So the mesh has Lisa's tissue still attached to it. And as you say, Lisa is a huge advocate for patient safety and patient awareness and the importance of listening to patients, and particularly women as well, because we have this extraordinary history of women not being listened to. So it's a fantastic thing to have in the exhibition and in the collection as well. Malcolm, also on display are ceremonial gifts from the Vedda community in Sri Lanka and from the Muskogee Nation, and these are displayed because these communities chose to share them. And from an international collecting perspective, that is a very different kind of relationship to the one that brought many international human remains and international objects into collections like those at Surgeons Hall and at the University of Edinburgh. It's worth pausing on that difference and what it means.
Yeah, I think this is a story with two chapters that are about 150 years apart. The first is the mid-19th century and this desire to collect skulls and body parts from all over the world. I've been thinking a little bit about this. I understand this because it was a thirst for knowledge. They wanted to compare different people. I think when we look at this with modern eyes, we say this was a bad thing, and it is a bad thing. There's no ethics attached to it. But I can understand these 1850s anatomists wanting to collect and look at skulls. Of course, they're collecting without consent. They're collecting without any collaboration with who they're collecting from. So for the case of the Vedda from Sri Lanka, these were skulls that came to us via the Edinburgh Phrenological Society, and in the case of the Muskogee Creek Nation, these were skulls that came to us via an American physician who was having links, sort of correspondence with the Professor of Anatomy at Edinburgh. No consent at all, and they've appeared in the museum collection. And then fast forward 150 years or so, we are returning these individuals. The process of return, or we have returned these individuals, the process of return is collaborative. We speak with the receiving community every step of the way in terms of how much press is involved, what happens in terms of the care of their ancestors, where they are in transit, how we would house them or store them as they're awaiting return, who they wanted to be as part of the delegation from the university, and then how we the post-return, we collaboratively talk about exhibitions, putting together, we receive ceremonial gifts, so we will talk to the people we have returned the remains to about interpretation in text and how we tell that story within the museum publicly. And some people would not want us to tell that story, and other communities do want us to tell that story. So we are entirely collaborative with this process, which I think couldn't be more markedly different than it was in the mid-19th century as it is today.
And describe the gifts that are on display for us.
We have a ceremonial axe, which was always present with the chief of the Vedda tribe. And just a little segue, when he was coming over to Edinburgh to receive the remains, he wanted to take his axe on the flight with him, which caused a lot of paperwork between me and the airlines, but eventually I think he was allowed to do that as well. For the Muskogee, we have it's a plate made of wood showing bear symbols on it, which is an animal that's very important to the Muskogee Creek Nation, and it was carved by a local carver as well. So really nice gifts. A lot of people say, oh, soon there'll be nothing left in museums because you've returned it all. But actually, we probably get 2 gifts for every skull that we return. So if anything, our museum collection is actually growing.
Sorry, that did make me laugh. I think what is so remarkable about this, and you're right, a lot of people view restitution and repatriation as some kind of floodgates opening. But those of us who work in the sector know that that's simply not true. These processes that take a really long time, but also they are so much more than just transactional processes, and they are so much more valuable. So they're about relationships and about developing these relationships which continue post-return. And the idea of ceremonial gifts coming and being displayed to tell the story of what happened 150 years ago and what is happening today is so incredibly important and so much richer than keeping human remains from international communities. And I think what's great is that for a lot of audiences, a lot of the sector, that is widely accepted, understood, and now it's about how do we do this work more.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a wider understanding now of the processes as well. It's not just a cut and paste from collections, and the careful, nuanced way that you have to work with communities to return, particularly human remains. I've been involved in, I think, about 8 now. Not one has been the same as the one before. They're all completely bespoke. And so that's what they could take a long time to process as well. Increasing understanding of the complexities of this sort of thing, I think, is quite important as well.
Definitely. So, Thomas, if someone is listening on their commute and they've never been to Surgeons Hall before, what is the one thing you would say to get them through the door to see this exhibition?
It looks fantastic. It is a very full and honest story, I think. It is about the progress that's made, and there has been remarkable progress. There has been incredible innovation. Edinburgh really was the place within the medical community. You know, this was the place that was all happening. So come and see for yourself, and I hope that visitors will feel refreshed, that we're not hiding behind the not so good parts of the story. You know, we're upfront, we're honest, and I think it tells a fuller story for that, because you know that's what life is and what humanity is. You know, it's not about pantomime goodies and baddies. It is it's much more nuanced than that, and every story has those sides to tell.
Well, I think you're right. I really hope that that speaks to you. If you haven't visited Surgeons Hall Museum before, come walk through the door. It is true that this remarkable history happened here in this place, which carries with it a really unique weight, I think, when you're standing in the space. So you both clearly enjoy working together. What made you laugh during the making of this?
Malcolm's constant insults. In the nicest possible way. No, we know each other so well. We've worked together for several years. We're friends, so it made it a very easy process. So for me, the fun was in the last week, putting things in cases together, both having a very similar view on things, and if there was some kind of organisational or logistics glitch, then we kind of just laughed it off together, and we knew it would come good.
Yeah, I was going to say exhibition curation and installation is not a laughing business, so we will not be laughing during working hours. But afterwards, we had plenty of laughs about it all. There was one episode where Thomas slightly put a panel up in the wrong position, and I don't know why, but I found it very funny. But I only laughed after the event, and I kept a very straight face during it. But as Thomas says, we know each other, and I think it's co-curation is weird because I don't normally work with somebody else for exhibition installation like this, so it was quite a good test as well. But I think we passed it with flying colours, hopefully.
And remarkably, we're still friends, so it was all good.
Absolutely. And also, complete lies. The amount of laughter that happened in the meetings that I was present, where I literally had to rein you both in. But listen, both this exhibition, you've spoken to it in different ways over the course of this podcast, but it is really honest about the human cost of medical progress. With that in mind, what do you hope people carry with them when they leave?
For me personally, I think the world is in such a strange place where everything is so polarized. Everyone has to, if you're not my friend, you're my enemy, which I think is a strange way to approach life. And so in a small way, that this exhibition, I think, does address that. You can have progress and cost in the same hand, it's part of the same hand, and we have to be honest about that. And we can celebrate, something incredible in terms of, an individual or an achievement or a bit of scientific progress, at the same time as acknowledging the cost of that progress. And it's not diminishing the innovation, and it's not also saying that the cost was negligible. We're giving both sides equal value, I think. And I think in the way the world is, in terms of politics and so on, I think it would all do well to remember that humans are complex creatures, and there are many sides to a story, and it's not just a polarized, oh, this is right and this is wrong.
I would say for your personal health care, be glad that you live in 2026 and not 1726. I would also be thankful for the people today who are consenting to donate their bodies as we continue to learn about the human body in sickness in particular. But also maybe think about the people who didn't consent, who did end up having their bodies dissected for similar aims, to be honest, in terms of understanding the human body. And the story's not over. We've got there's an inscription in the medical school quad attributed to Hippocrates, which is engraved beneath a clock. It says, Ars longa vita brevis, art is long, life is short. And he's talking about the art of medicine. And so there's, what will the medical school look in 400 years, for another 100 years' time? The story's not over. There's a new chapter to come. This is just very much one point in time in a long, long history of medicine.
Well, I think that's a perfect way to end. Thank you both so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Knife, a medical history podcast brought to you by Surgeons Hall Museums, Library and Archives. To find out more about us, you can visit www.museum.rcsed.ac.uk. You can also follow us on our social media channels. Join us wherever you get your podcasts.